So hello, I'm here with Apollo Monroe. Thanks very much for coming on.
No problem. Thank you for having me, Dylan.
So so Dale, otherwise known as Apollo Monroe, can you start by I suppose, giving us an introduction to yourself and your music? I suppose if you had to explain it to someone that hadn't heard it before, what would you tell them?
Right. So I guess the thing, so it's called hyperpop. That is technically the coined genre at the
Yeah.
moment they are trying to label it with. And of a lot of like online discourse because it's it is very hard to define, but yet somehow there's still like some little small detail that manages to,
Mm.
I guess, crowd it all together. And basically, I guess in explaining it, I'd suggest that it's like this really maximalist sound. Um, it takes like a bunch of different influences from like genres such as like early 2000s dance pop, EDM. It even takes certain with vocal flows and or like lyrics, stuff like that. But yeah, so basically then hyperpop itself, it's kind of this combination of it stems back to like SoundCloud, sound rap on SoundCloud back in the early 2010s. But a lot of it kind of goes back to Sophie, who just recently tragically passed. She was a huge pioneer for this kind of in that kind of popularized in like 2014, and then that combined with AG Cook and the British PC Music Collective, which on their own were kind of doing these I guess like really sweet and melodic, catchy, pitched up bubblegum, like bubblegum pop sounds that were really what's the word I'm looking for? I guess manufactured sounding. And
Okay.
then throughout the years, they kind of Charlie XCX kind of jumped in on this and kind of helmed the sound and popularized the sound, and it's now the sound that we kind of know as hyperpop now.
Okay, so like there's a lot in that. There's a lot to unpack there. I suppose if you had to name out any artists in particular who have kind of served as an inspiration, who would you look to?
I'd say definitely Sophie. I mean, when it comes
Okay.
to production and stuff like that, Sophie was probably the biggest influence. Even me and the co-producer on the track Viscos, her production, um, trying to just nail the sound that I wanted,
Yeah.
sonically. And then aside from Sophie, I guess Charlie XCX, she's kind of like this. I guess it's like the experimental genre of hyperpop meets this mainstream pop artist, and that is kind of what you get. She's managed to kind of popularize the genre in way I guess no other artist really has been able
Mm.
to. And then I'd say lastly would be 100 Gex. They rose to fame 2 years ago. They're kind of, in fact, genre namesake kind of stems from the curated playlist on Spotify, which basically that playlist was created so the 100 Gex, while they were blown up, their music had a place to go on Spotify, as they didn't really fit any other playlist. So they're kind of, I guess, the helm of why that genre title came around.
Yeah, so you mentioned a lot there about, stuff like SoundCloud and people kind of taking inspiration off each other and kind of making the genre into their own thing. Do you think it's like kind of, let's say, an experimental thing like that, this kind of bedroom talent, for want of a better word? Do you think it's that kind of really independent, really kind of do our own thing style?
Yeah, no, for real. I mean, even the as popular as the hyperpop playlist is on Spotify, I'd say the majority, I'd say like 80% of the acts on it are unsigned. I mean, like it is
Okay.
really this whole kind of DIY producer in his bedroom. And a lot of the acts, in fact, are even underage. Like there's a lot of
Hmm.
teens getting into this to kind of pay loads of producers to make these beats for them. So they're kind of getting into their own DAWs and just kind of doing it themselves.
So it's fairly niche then, is what you would say.
It's an interesting thing because it does have a lot of elements that mainstream music kind of does incorporate. I mean,
Hmm.
there's a lot of hooky choruses. It's filled with hooks. I mean, that's kind of one of its most prominent, I guess, like techniques. To be, I actually believe there was this really one. There was a quote I saw just recently where basically hyperpop is pop music made by experimental producers,
Okay.
and that's kind of what it is. There is a lot of elements, and even over the last year, it has kind of been referred to. There's been a lot of like articles kind of dissecting if this is the future of pop, because it does
Yeah.
have that like soul to it. So, but yeah, some people still find it quite too experimental to be considered mainstream.
So, how did you get interested in the genre then? And I suppose more broadly, what's your history of music and what's your
I
history
guess
with, I suppose, how did you get to where you are today?
Well, I guess obviously, or not obviously, but I went to BIMM, which is in Dublin. It's the music college there, and during my time through at BIMM, I was really into a lot of 80s synth pop and like a lot of modern artists who incorporate that 80s synth pop stuff like Carly Rae Jepsen. I mean, even a lot of artists nowadays are even kind of dabbling in it with like The Weeknd
Yeah.
has kind of this weird hybrid of like um disco and 80s synth pop going on in their songs. So I was really into that genre. And then through that, I kind of got into this like internet culture of a lot of these artists, specifically it kind of stemmed from the Carly Rae Jepsen stuff where it was pop, but it was kind of considered underground.
Okay.
So I realized how some of my although I love pop, a lot of my favorite pop acts kind of are considered underground pop.
Mm.
So so yeah, through that and then in 2016, even though Charlie XCX was kind of this like pop punk, I mean, the Sucker that she released in 2013, which was like her biggest, um, like her best-selling album, um, I got into that. And then in 2016, she kind of geared up with Sophie, and they released this EP called Vroom Vroom. And this EP got like critical acclaim out the gate. There was only 4 songs on it, but specifically Vroom Vroom on the EP, it was nothing I've ever heard. There was like these industrial beats going against this really bubblegum pop chorus, and it just seems super chaotic and super experimental. And I didn't know if I liked it at the time. And then through Charlie and Sophie, I kind of got introduced to like more of these artists. And then whilst in BIM, I was in a synth pop band called Apollo 6. And but whilst I was with them, I was kind of wanted to move in a more experimental direction because that's where my music taste was going. Because I feel like I've just after like I just haven't heard. So I got really intrigued by it, and then so me and kind of I guess the band that I was in, we kind of split apart, and I guess it was a huge part was because I did want to go in this more experimental route, which I felt you kind of had to be solo doing because it was
Yeah.
so you and a producer. Writing I couldn't be writing parts for a guitarist or writing parts for a bassist anymore because it was just going to be me and a producer going forward.
Okay. So I think that brings us neatly into your first solo single called Sodapop, which is it out yet right now as of recording?
It is indeed, yes. It came out on the 19th, so last Friday.
Okay, so the song is out now, and can you kind of give us the story behind the track and what it's all about?
So it's a song that I actually wrote, I'd say 2 years ago now. I kind of got the gist of it. I was walking one day and I came up with this really catchy chorus hook. So like I sang it into my phone with the band at the time, and I just knew it wasn't something that we were going to do. So I kind of just shelved it, even though I thought
Mm,
it could be something really cool. I just shelved it. And then it was October 2019 when me and my band actually we just had our last gig, and the guy who opened for the gig, his name's Viscos. He's an incredible Dublin artist as well, who is going to be releasing his own stuff later this year. But yeah, so after the gig, I was like, hey, look, you're a really cool producer. I have this track, and it looks like me and the band are going to. Do you want to co-produce this with me? Because he was way more experienced with like DAWs and everything. So he said yeah, and we just got working on it. And yeah, I just wanted this, I guess like I wanted this kind of crazy song that the verses were kind of had like trap influence, and there was a lot of like flow in the vocals and flow in the melodies, and I wanted the verses to be quite heavy production wise, a lot of industrial sounding synths and stuff like that. Wanted it to contrast with this like really cutesy bubblegum pop chorus that like
mm.
people would just kind of not expect, that when it came up in the song, they were kind of like, whoa, I didn't expect us to go there. Because I like that idea of like kind of getting people to assume something and then just completely going against it, kind of giving them a
Yeah.
surprise, especially when they're expecting just a normal pop song. Um, so yeah, so that's how the production kind of came about. When it comes to the actual song, so I guess it's kind of ironic because I think a lot of people, just on the surface, the song lyrics, they do seem to be very sensual and sexually implied. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to be like, oh, it's a like, it's kind of this raunchy song
Mm,
about where they use like metaphors for soda as potentially metaphors for something else more sinister.
mm.
However, um it's actually, the song itself is actually about the pop music industry, and I use the kind of sensual sexual innuendo the industry has preferred to present pop artists and pop artistry over, I guess, since forever, to be fair. So that's the reason why I wanted to use the innuendos, but the actual song is kind of a criticism on pop artistry and modern pop artistry in the industry today, because it's kind of making this comparison between pop artists and these like highly manufactured, sugary soft drinks, you know, promotion everywhere. They're not good for you, but yet we still kind of what the actual basis of the song is.
So, so yeah, like you know, again, like there's a lot there, and you know, the actual genre and the actual music really it brings together a lot of different genres. You were mentioning something there a bit earlier. We were talking about how this kind of almost disco style, like The Weekend and like have really become mainstream in the past few years. Do you think that do you think that the hyperpop genre kind of takes that disco or kind of takes let's say retro for want of a better word, and do you think that's a large part of it, or do you think it's something else a bit more modern?
Yeah, well, I do think I know 100 Gex actually said this on the genre. There's a lot of nostalgia in the genre. There's something familiar to, I guess, specifically familiar to Gen Zs and like younger millennials,
Yeah,
because because of the dance pop influence, it kind of, to me it certainly sounds like a lot of vocally and um like lyric wise of the late 90s or the early 2000s, but then it also kind of has these elements of like Britney Spears and um I'm trying to think, boy bands like NSYNC and everything like that. So yeah, I and then obviously of course the 80s new wave and synth pop elements are there as well. So I do think it's part of the appeal of the genre. I think people kind of do sense some form of nostalgia or do sense some form of retro um like musicianship. I'm sure I could write a thesis on it, but I do think there's definitely a nostalgic element to the like use of um influences throughout it.
you mentioned, it's interesting that we talk about the whole nostalgia side of things and retro side of things because like you mentioned that there's a lot of underage artists really getting into the hyperpop genre,
Mm.
and like do you have any idea kind of why that is, or I suppose what makes it appeal to a particular demographic?
I do think it's kind of I do think, going back to the nostalgic thing, I mean, this is literally what the kids have been brought up on. All these influences are from artists that they grew up loving, you know. I mean,
Mm,
you could kind of say that the like return of like 80s synth pop, which kind of happened in the 2010s, were because the people making that music at the time grew up in the 80s or the late 80s, and so that
yeah.
was the music of the pop stars. They decided they want to do that music, and I think it is kind of the same. I think it just happens to be that this certain generation um does want to duplicate just the music they grew up hearing. And then I think what's also part of the appeal is hyperpop. They're usually quite attitude like driven, and then really short as well. I mean, a lot of hyperpop songs fall under 3 minutes, and some of them are even 1 minute and something. And I think that kind of speaks to like the Gen Zs who grew up where like maybe the attention span is just slightly smaller, and as a result, they just kind of like it a bit more.
Okay. Do you think that the genre is approachable? Like, do you think it's kind of, let's say, easy to get in there and make a name for yourself, I suppose?
In regards to make a name for yourself, um like I guess I can't exactly speak on it because this is just the first track, and I don't, although like friendly reactions from people in the scene, I don't know if like it's as easy to make a name for yourself exactly when the audience is still on a smaller scale.
Mm.
But I do think that part of the genre kind of champions itself on inclusion.
Yeah.
And I do think that probably because of its smaller nature, there's like definitely an online community vibe. And I think that kind of stems into the internet culture of which it's kind of birthed from, like when you go back to SoundCloud. So I do think there's a lot of like online support. I mean, alone, the amount of like people, like the amount of American teens, young adults who love hyperpop who have written to me being like, hey, I just heard your song, it's great. And then even bigger hyperpop artists who have like reached out to me and or followed me since being like, hey, your music's really good, you should hop on a track, or if you ever need a feature. And like these are artists that have like 10 to like 17,000 Instagram followers, and if they were influencers they'd probably be unreachable, but because they're hyperpop artists and because um yeah, they seem to just be really supportive of each other and really supportive of younger artists and smaller artists coming into the genre.
Okay, that sounds fantastic. Like, it sounds like a great scene to be fair. I
Yeah,
suppose,
it's pretty exciting.
we're nearly run out of time actually, but I suppose just before we finish up, can you give us a bit of a idea as to, obviously it's still early days, but can you give us an idea as to what your plans are going forward?
Well, going release a music video, a quarantine-esque music video for Sodapop, hopefully in the next 2 weeks. And aside from that, I guess I'm just going to keep making music. I may have a certain feature on the second single, which I'm hoping to release in May. And it may be a certain feature of a Dublin, like queer synth pop band who I'm a huge fan of, and they have quite a bit of following. So that's going to be super exciting as well.
Very nice. So yeah, exciting things to come, it sounds. So yeah, I think that brings us nicely to the end. Just before we finish up, if people are looking online, where can they find you?
They can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, all under Apollo Monroe with a 3 at the end instead of the
Okay.
last E.
Okay, so this is Apollo Monroe. Thanks very much. Watch this space, and hopefully we'll hear a lot more from
Thank you
you
so much for having
very
me, Dylan.
soon. My pleasure.